An old woman sits in a wood-paneled dining room, silverware catching the light from a chandelier that has swung gently over this same table for 73 years. She is 91. Waiters in white gloves know her by name. Outside the porthole, the Atlantic rolls by, grey and endless, the way it has every crossing since she was a girl. The ship's name is painted in gold on the stern, Titanic. It never sank. This is the world where the lookout spotted the iceberg 14 seconds earlier, where 14 seconds bought enough time to turn. On April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m. ship's time, lookout Frederick Fleet in the crow's nest spotted a shape rising out of the dark water ahead. He rang the bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the engines reversed and the wheel turned hard. The ship began to swing. It almost worked. The iceberg scraped along roughly 300 feet of the hull below the waterline, popping rivets and buckling steel plates across 6 of the 16 watertight compartments. 5 compartments could flood, and the ship would still float. 6 was one too many. Water poured in faster than the pumps could handle, and the bow began to settle by 2 in the morning. In our history, the ship broke apart and sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes, and around 1,500 people died in water so cold it stopped hearts within minutes. Move that iceberg 14 seconds to the left, or move the ship 14 seconds sooner into its turn, and the scrape becomes a graze along 4 compartments instead of 6. The Titanic survives on the same margin that killed her in our world, just tipped the other way. She limps into Halifax 2 days later under her own power, dented and taking on water in her forward holds, but afloat, with everyone still aboard. The story that made Titanic famous never happens. There is no ship of dreams sinking on her maiden voyage, no band playing as the deck tilted, no headline about the unsinkable ship proving not to be. Instead, there's a much smaller story, a near miss, buried on page 4, beneath news about a coal strike and a French election. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, gives a brief statement to reporters in Halifax and returns home to a company that had a scare, but no catastrophe. He never becomes the man blamed for taking a lifeboat seat while women and children waited on a sinking deck, because in this world, no one had to make that choice at all. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, walks off the ship in Halifax with his pregnant 19-year-old wife. He goes back to New York, back to building skyscrapers and hotels, and lives another 20, maybe 30 years. His son, born a few months later, grows up with a father instead of a photograph. The Astor fortune, one of the largest in the country, keeps compounding under his direct management instead of passing early into the hands of trustees managing an estate. Real estate empires he might have built simply exist now, changing the skyline of a city that in our history he never got to see grow up around his unfinished plans. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida survived together, the same way they'd have died together in our history when she refused a lifeboat seat rather than leave him. Benjamin Guggenheim doesn't change into his evening clothes to die like a gentleman, because there's no need. He goes on running the family's mining interests for another decade at least, and the philanthropic foundation his daughter Peggy eventually built, the one that shaped modern art collecting in the 20th century, grows up under a different set of family dynamics entirely, with her father present, rather than a story she carried about the night he chose to die well. None of these people become legends. That's the strange cost of survival. A man who dies bravely on a sinking ship gets remembered forever. A man who has an uneventful, if harrowing, Atlantic crossing gets a paragraph in a shipping company's incident report, and then goes back to his ordinary, extraordinary life. Captain Edward Smith, 62 years old and planning to retire after this very voyage, brings his ship into Halifax instead of going down with her. He doesn't become the captain who supposedly told his crew, "Be British," as the deck slipped under his feet. Because there was no deck slipping, no final act of quiet duty for history to memorialize. He retires quietly a few months later as originally planned, gives a handful of interviews about the near miss, and lives out his years in relative anonymity, one more competent officer of a fleet that mostly didn't make headlines. The dozens of crew members who in our history stayed at their posts feeding coal into furnaces that kept the lights on until the final minutes. The wireless operators who kept sending distress signals until the water reached their ankles. The stewards who guided passengers to boats they had no seat on themselves. All of them simply finish an unusually tense shift and go back to ordinary duties on an ordinary crossing. Their courage, real in either timeline, gets no monument in this one, because there's no tragedy to hang it on. Down in third class, the story shifts in ways that matter just as much, even if history books rarely bother to name these passengers individually. In our history, the survival rate for third-class passengers was barely a quarter, trapped behind locked gates meant to satisfy American immigration inspectors, confused by unfamiliar corridors, and given the least information about what was actually happening above decks. In this timeline, those same immigrant families, mostly from Ireland, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, arrive in Halifax exactly as planned, delayed by 2 days and a great deal of fright, but alive and still holding the tickets that were supposed to carry them into a new life in America. Thousands of descendants exist now who, in our history, simply don't. Somewhere in this alternate world, a great-granddaughter of a Slovak farmer who never got on a lifeboat because he never needed one, runs a business in Chicago, or teaches school in Boston, entirely unaware that her own existence once depended on 14 seconds of a ship's turn on a cold night in the North Atlantic. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer from Harland and Wolff in Belfast, is aboard for this maiden voyage, the same way he was in our history, checking fittings and noting small improvements for the next ship in the class. In our timeline, he spent his final hour helping passengers into lifeboats before disappearing into the flooding first-class smoking room, last seen staring at a painting of a ship entering harbor, having calculated with an engineer's certainty that the vessel he built could not be saved. In this one, he walks the decks after the collision with a very different kind of dread, watching his own calculations play out in real time as the crew reports flooding in 6 compartments instead of the 4 or 5 his design could safely absorb. He spends the 2-day limp into Halifax doing math nobody else on board fully understands, watching pumps hold a margin he knows is thinner than anyone realizes, and he goes home to Belfast afterward, not as a tragic figure, but as the engineer who quietly saved his own ship through nothing more than luck and structural overdesign. He spends the rest of his career pushing the shipping industry toward exactly the safety standards that, in our history, only got written into law after his death made them politically unavoidable. Here, nobody's listening as closely, because nobody had to bury him first. The regulatory story changes too, and not for the better. In our history, the Titanic disaster triggered the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea in 1914, forcing every ocean liner to carry enough lifeboats for every soul aboard, mandating 24-hour radio watches, and establishing the International Ice Patrol that still tracks icebergs in the North Atlantic today. Titanic sailed with lifeboat space for barely half her passengers and crew, fully within the outdated regulations of the time, because the rules were written for a smaller, older generation of ships. In this world, no disaster means no public outrage, no congressional hearings, no urgent international convention. The lifeboat shortage on ocean liners doesn't get fixed in 1914. It gets fixed later, after some other ship, in some other year, hits some other iceberg with a full complement of passengers and not enough boats. That's the quiet horror hiding inside this alternate timeline. The math didn't disappear. Ships kept crossing an ocean that grows icebergs every spring, still carrying too few lifeboats. Still following outdated safety codes nobody had an urgent reason to rewrite. Maybe it's the Lusitania, torpedoed in 1915, that finally forces the lifeboat reforms. Except now with a passenger list drowning in a wartime attack instead of a peacetime accident, muddying the safety lesson with questions of military strategy instead of naval engineering. Maybe it takes 2 disasters instead of 1, spread across a decade, before regulators fully close the gap our history closed in a single stroke after that April night. Every year the fix gets delayed is another year of ships crossing the Atlantic one bad night away from repeating a disaster that, in this world, everyone insists could never really happen. Because look, didn't the Titanic prove herself in 1912? She hit an iceberg and made it to port. She's the safest ship ever built. That confidence, born from a lucky 14 seconds, becomes exactly the kind of overconfidence that gets people killed on some other ship down the line. Popular culture loses something too, something harder to quantify than lifeboats. There's no 1997 film pulling in over $2 billion worldwide, no Celine Dion song playing in 1 million cars, no cultural touchstone that an entire generation uses as shorthand for doomed romance and unimaginable disaster. The story of Jack and Rose was never real, but it was built on top of something that was. Specific, devastating night that actually happened to actual people. Take away the real disaster and you take away the emotional foundation an entire industry of documentaries, books, and films eventually built on top of it. The ship becomes a footnote instead of a myth. Ask someone born in the 1990s of this alternate world what happened to the Titanic, and most of them shrug. Wasn't that the big ship that had some kind of accident once? Didn't sink though, did it? Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who located the wreck in 1985 using deep-sea robotics developed partly through a classified Navy program, spends his career on other things instead. Other ships, other mysteries at the bottom of other oceans, never becoming the man who found Titanic, because there was never a 2.5-mile deep wreck sitting on the ocean floor waiting to be found. The entire field of deep-sea wreck archaeology develops along a different timeline too, missing the single most famous proof of concept that, in our history, made the public fall in love with what robotic submersibles could do. The ship herself keeps sailing for years after that near miss, repaired and reinforced, carrying passengers back and forth across an ocean that almost claimed her once. Maybe she serves as a troop transport in the First World War, the same way her sister ship Titanic did in our history before striking a mine and sinking in the Aegean in 1916. Maybe Titanic survives that too, on some other set of margins, some other 14 seconds that this time go the other way. Or maybe her luck runs out somewhere else entirely, in some other decade, in some other ocean, and the ship that famously didn't sink in 1912 quietly goes down in a storm in the 1930s instead, taking a few hundred people with her, making barely a ripple in the history books because by then she's just another aging liner, not a symbol of anything. That old woman in the dining room, 91 years old, crossing the Atlantic on a ship that first carried her as an infant in her mother's arms in 1912, has no idea she's living inside the version of this story where the ship made it. She doesn't know that 14 seconds in some other version of April decided whether her family line continued at all. She just knows the food is good tonight, and the sea is calm, and somewhere below her, 6 watertight compartments that almost weren't enough are holding, the way they've held for 73 years, the way small margins hold until, eventually, somewhere, for someone, they don't.